video. So welcome everyone to our Troubleshooting Tomato and Other Vegetable Diseases with Bob Hochmuth. He's one of our RSAs, or Regional Specialized Extension Agents here in North Florida, and does a lot of work with vegetable diseases and vegetables in general. I am one of your hostess today. My name is Erin Harlow. I am the horticulture agent here in Columbia County and one of the hosts behind the Victory 2020 Garden Program. We also have Maxine Hunter on, and she will be helping. She's the horticulture agent in Marion County, and also one of the hostess for the Victory 2020 Garden Program as well. So you may hear either one of us jump in and help with your questions. We do have the chat box there. Please ask questions there, and then we'll get to those. If we don't get to them at the end, we will be collecting all of the questions if we need to, and then sending those back out via email. I know Bob has a lot that he wants to cover today. So with that, Bob, I will go ahead and turn it over to you.
All right. Thanks for the opportunity to share a little bit about vegetable diseases here over the next hour. And I'm going to try to do this so that there's a little bit of time left at the end so that we can do some of the chat kinds of opportunities. Just to let you know, I'm going to focus mostly on tomatoes. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about will have applications to other crops as well. Erin and Maxine have asked me to have a couple of special disease issues that are in the cucurbit groups, squash in particular, that I'll also insert towards the end. So that's my game plan here today. And first thing I want to do is to kind of give credit where credit's due. Over the years, I've borrowed, stolen pieces of this from several other of the professors and specialists at the University of Florida to be able to put this thing together for you. And I've given this recognition here on this particular slide. Many of them scattered around the state at either other research centers or on campus. So what I want to try to do is to kind of walk you through here. I'm going to take the approach that we're sort of detectives here. I think it's most important that we understand how to identify the disease first of all, and that's the skill that I really think is most important to all of us. The recommendations for different kinds of controls change over time, but the detective work never changes. So I'm going to be trying to help work through a little bit of that, kind of provide some hints here from a disease standpoint as to try to figure out what's wrong with the plant that you're looking at. In this case, much of this will be on tomatoes, but is it an environmental stress? Is it a nutritional deficiency, chemical injury, insect damage? And if it is an infectious disease of some kind, is it a fungus, virus, or a bacteria? Or in another category, could it potentially be nematodes? Just jumping back up to the first one this year, this spring here in North Florida has been really, really different. We had a very hot March and a very cold April. And even in our commercial situations, we're seeing some really unusual things that seem to be able to be taken back to that wicked first week in April in particular. So anyway, there's a lot of things that can, excuse me, that can happen. Just a few guiding principles that I look for in this situation, especially when you're trying to decipher what's going on. First of all, don't shoot from the hip. Sometimes the first inclination is correct, but I would just say be patient and go through this process. For those of you that are in master gardener roles or extension agent roles, I think it's most important to be a really good listener to the person that has this issue. Always ask a lot of questions and sort of look back on the most recent weather patterns in the past few days. What's the weather been like? What have you done recently in terms of a fertilizer or a spray application, for instance? Keep a hand lens handy so that you can always see more than you can always see more with a hand lens or a scope than what you can with the naked eye. And at my age, I need hand lenses just to see the basic stuff. So that's an important piece of equipment that would be helpful to you. The other thing over the period in my career that really helps a lot is we all have iPhones, we all have the ability to take a picture, and we all have the opportunity to send them through your extension agent, and oftentimes those can be diagnosed reasonably well from a photograph, but there's the network through the extension system in the various states that we can get those pictures to folks that may be in the best position to be able to help you. So there are a number of different web type programs here at the University of Florida. The U-Scout program at the Research Center in Quincy is a really good practical diagnostic tool for us to be able to work through some of this. From a disease standpoint, many of you have probably seen this before, but it's really important to review. We've got the disease triangle here, and you have to have all three of these sides completed before you're going to get a disease. You have to have a susceptible host, you have to have the right environmental conditions, and then you have to have the pathogen present. And if all three of those come together, that's going to be the situation where you can, where you're going to be able to have a disease that will be infectious and take off. So for instance, if we have a host, a susceptible variety of tomatoes, and we know that the fungus organism is in the area, but we can somehow modify the environmental conditions that we can break that cycle and reduce the likelihood of that particular pathogen becoming a problem. So any one of these three components of the triangle, if we can break the triangle, we can reduce the incidence of diseases. So as I mentioned, I'm going to focus on tomatoes, and the way that we've got this thing set up is that there's a number of categories here that I have sort of identified, and the first group is going to be those that are soil-borne organisms that are creating wilting issues, then leaf spots, and then some other unusual yellowing or stunting, and also some of the damage that would actually occur on the fruit. So I do look at these as very important aspects to determine in the diagnosis what is it what's going on. If we can break them into these categories, and a lot of times we can begin to do our CSI work, and as a detective try to narrow down the options through this process. So the first one here is going to be sort of a sudden and general wilting. So we've planted our tomato crop, or whatever other crop it might be, but in this case, tomatoes is what I'm going to be focusing on. And everything has gone really, really well. And then suddenly we have a general wilt of a specific plant within that group. So you might have 20 or 30 tomato plants, and there's only plant number 2 and plant number 17 that have suddenly wilted. So we want to investigate what's going on in those couple of particular plants. And I've got listed here the options that might be available to us. So when I go into this situation, the first thing that I want to look for is to make sure that there's not something obvious like things have gotten dry or a recent flooding, something like that. So point number 7 here on the possible reasons is going to be the first thing that I'm going to investigate, to make sure that the plants themselves are getting enough moisture. And oftentimes in situations where there's not enough moisture or general flooding, you're going to have more than plant number 2 and plant number 17 that are going to show that symptom. So in this case, very specifically, where you don't have all of the plants reacting in the same way, it probably is less likely to be irrigation, either too much or too little. But we want to eliminate the possibility that there's something going on in the soil moisture level, either too much or too little. If we assume that everything is good there, then we're going to have these other options 1 through 6 that might be possibilities, and I'm going to go through them one by one. What I'm going to do first is to look at the base of the plant. In the case of wilting, when the entire plant wilts, you need to track it back to the root system, or in this case, maybe to the collar of the tomato plant right at the ground level, and investigate what's going on that particular plant. In this slide, you see a lot of white mycelial growth right at the collar region and adjacent to the soil. And so in this particular instance, southern blight which is Sclerotium rolfsi, is the organism that causes this, initially shows up with this white mycelial mass. And you can see here that it took a little bit of time for that collar to be totally disintegrated, but eventually when it got through to the point where it shut off the ability of the plant, especially to take up water, then it shut this whole plant down, and it happened suddenly. So a couple things that oftentimes will lead up to this is that the plants have been doing okay, you didn't notice this, and all of a sudden you've got a lot of fruit load that is sizing up on it, and it's been relatively cool perhaps, and then all of a sudden here in Florida we go into those really hot days, and so when we get to that point where the plant can no longer pick up enough water to support the fruit load that it has, then that's when you're going to get the sudden wilt, and it can happen very quickly. So, so when you get to those situations, especially once there's a lot of fruit load on them, be aware that that's when the collapse can occur. If you let that same plant go for a few more days, then you're going to get the reproductive structures of this particular organism, and it looks to me like mustard seed. It looks like somebody took mustard seed and glued them into this white mycelial mass, and so this is the part you don't want to see, because these are the resting spores that are going to stay in that soil for a longer period of time. So if you are able to catch it before these resting spores get going, it's going to be a lot easier to get that out of the garden. So with these kinds of serious diseases, these plants should be taken carefully out of the garden, even if you remove some of the soil associated with this collar and root mass as well. Get it all out of the field, put it in a garbage bag. Do not put some of these kinds of things on a compost pile, because even though you may get temperatures in the middle, it's difficult in some of these hard resting spores to be able to kill them through a normal composting plan. So be careful with these kinds of organisms. So that's the way that southern blight will happen. Here in North Florida, this is actually a very common organism. It attacks a number of different vegetables, peppers and tomatoes, the cucurbit group. All of these could be affected by this particular organism. The next one that I want to go to here is initially looks kind of similar perhaps to what we had just seen, where you got some white mycelial mass down at the base. It's not exactly the same, but we would agree, hopefully, that these look pretty similar. The first picture of the white mycelial mass versus this one. Upon further investigation, however, we, in this case, would not see the little mustard seeds, and if we cut this open, we would see a different resting spore here, and these are called sclerotia, and this is Sclerotinia blight. This one is even more difficult and more serious than the previous one, from the ability of these resting spores to stay for a long period of time. So both of these organisms are sort of attacking at the base of the plant, sudden collapse, and upon further investigation, we see that there's activity at the collar. As I move forward here, it may not be as obvious that there's something happening at the collar level. So this would be one of the first CSI kinds of activities that we need to worry about. So I'm just going to pause there for a moment. Erin and Maxine, is this going okay? And just let me keep going forward, or how would you like to proceed?
You're doing great.
Okay.
Keep it going.
All right. The next one would be a situation where we have this same wilted looking plant on the left-hand side, and from a distance, we can't tell anything yet. So we have to get down and first look at the collar area, as I've indicated in the past two diseases. But let's say that we investigate the collar and it's not obvious that there's anything going on. There's no white mold. There's no, no definitive thing going on at the collar level. And so now we've got a little bit more investigation to do, and we're going to have to pull this plant up, and we're going to have to do a couple of diagnostic things to help us to try to narrow down what may be going on. The next disease on this picture is a disease called bacterial wilt, and so we've pulled this plant up. we're cutting across the crown or down around that collar level. And we're going to first do a little test to see if we see bacterial streaming occurring. And this is actually pretty cool when it happens for bacterial wilt, and that's the way the pathologists look at it. This is really cool to see this bacterial streaming. May not be cool for the gardener, but you would cut across the stem and suspend that top, suspend this cross section of the base of the stem in a clear glass of water. And over a period of time, and it usually doesn't take very long in bad cases, you'll see this ooze coming out of the base of the stems. And that's the bacteria that's streaming out of the vessels within this cross section of the stem. And if you see that, then you know that something is going on here from a bacterial standpoint, and bacterial wilt would be the most likely scenario. But let's say that you put that in there and it doesn't stream, then we probably could at least reduce the likelihood that it's going to be due to bacteria. These samples need to be fresh when you do this, and when I have done this, it's really cool when you do it. And it has to be a real clear jar. If it's a sort of a cloudy looking glass or container, it's hard sometimes to see that. So let's say that we've done the streaming activity and nothing came up, but we still have this wilted plant. And now we have some other investigation to go. We still don't see any white fuzzy mass on the collar. The collar seems to be healthy all the way down into the crown. And so now we need to do a little further investigation here, still some diagnostic stuff. You see here that this particular plant has loaded up with fruit and was able to get enough water and nutrient up into that plant for a pretty long period of time. And then suddenly, with a lot of fruit load on it and probably a high temperature day, it suddenly couldn't do it anymore. And I always think of this as like, I really like strawberry milkshakes, and it's that time when you get the strawberry stuck in the bottom of the straw and you can't get the strawberry milkshake up. That's sort of my simple way of thinking about what's happening here. They just can't pick up the water and nutrients to go to the top part of the plant, and suddenly the whole plant collapses in a hurry. So when you cut across these crowns, and so now if you look on the right hand side especially, you see where I'm making this cut right across at the ground level. So the collar is intact on the exterior, but once we cut into it on the inside, we see this discoloration, and especially shows up really well on an early stage on the left picture here, where you get this browning of the water conducting vessels in the plant. This could be either Fusarium or verticillium. I would say it's really difficult and not practical to be able to determine the difference between these two. There are some key characteristics that might help the way the plants look, but if they both suddenly decline, then it could be either Fusarium or verticillium. I must say, though, that in my experience, verticillium has been relatively rare. Fusarium has been relatively common when we look at the two of these. There are varieties that are resistant to verticillium and Fusarium in the tomato garden world, and that's certainly one of those things that you would want to be able to look at. The next disease is certainly one here in Florida that is a problem. For those of you that are in other very northern states, this may or may not even be an issue where you are. So I'll just touch on this briefly. This is a serious problem for us here in Florida, and it's known as tomato spotted wilt. And this is a disease that the plant also has been going along pretty well. It's loaded up with fruit, and it's not a sudden wilting collapse like we saw in all of the other situations. In this case, it looks more like somebody poured hot grease or hot water on the top of the plant, and you get a lot of this scalding looking symptoms on the top part of the plant. But when we look a little bit more closely, there's actually circular regions within this particular disease. It's tomato spotted wilt, and tomato spotted wilt is transmitted by an insect in this area, or a group of species in the thrips family. So that's the only way that it is transmitted. There are resistant varieties to tomato spotted wilt that will help us to get out of this. And across North Florida here, from Jacksonville to Tallahassee or to Quincy, there's varying levels of maybe 5% likelihood of getting it in a garden tomato. But when you get over in the area around Quincy, where there's a lot of tomatoes that are grown, there's a high likelihood that gardens in that vicinity are going to have this, because the population of thrips in that region have built up the level there that it becomes a pretty serious situation there. Otherwise, for me here in Live Oak, this is something that I would expect to see a small population, 5, 10, 15% of the tomatoes in a research trial here at the center on a susceptible variety. I would expect to be able to get it. This is the symptoms. All of these pictures are tomato spotted wilt. They all have similar characteristics, but yet they all look a little bit different. The reason that it's called tomato spotted wilt is these spots that are produced on the leaves, but also more distinctly on the fruit. So this is an internal virus. The thrips, as soon as they begin to feed, transmit the virus into the plant, and it'll get to a certain point where everything looks good, but then all of a sudden it'll stop growing. Everything, the tomatoes on either side of it might still be going strong, but this one all of a sudden is stopped. And when you look down at the tomato plant, you think, wow, there's something almost look like I was indicating earlier, that hot grease or hot water was poured on the top of the plant and sort of scalded or scorched the top leaves, but it's actually the virus that has shut down those leaves and they've succumbed to the heat. So that kind of takes us through, let me just go back here for a minute. That kind of takes us through the organisms that can cause sort of a wilt, although the tomato spotted wilt is not as significant a wilt as the others. And I've included another organism in here, and that's the root knot nematode. This is one of the few things that if you're in Florida and sandy soils, I'll give you a written guarantee. I don't tend to give out written guarantees, but I'll give you a written guarantee that eventually you're going to face root knot nematodes here in this region. And I think it's a pretty common organism throughout the South, especially in the northern climates. It may be a little bit less of a problem because the winters will kill these in the upper part of the soil, but here we don't have that advantage, and so the nematodes can survive for a longer period of time. These are microscopic roundworms. They're not a pathogen, they're not a disease, it's a living organism, and yet the results are going to look very similar to the wilts that we have just seen. So in this case, carrots on the lower left and tomato plant on the upper right, where you see the root system here does not look normal. It's got these swollen gall looking or knotty looking areas on the root system. You see very little fine hair roots. So this root system is very much compromised, and it has difficulty in picking up water and nutrients, just like we had in the other wilt organism cases. So from the top, it might look very similar. There are some indicator crops in my mind. The cucurbit group, squashes and cucumbers, are very susceptible to this. Cantaloupes are very susceptible. And then the other one is okra. So if you grow okra in the same area year after year, you're almost guaranteed to run into some problems with this. So in this case, the plants don't even really start out even. They just look stunted. They look like they're not getting enough water. They look like they're not getting enough fertilizer. And this will tend not just to be an isolated individual plant. It'll tend to be more of a part of a row. It might, say 100 foot of row of okra, and you've got 20 feet of it that just looks sad. Everything else looks fine, and you know that they've all been getting the same water and fertilizer. To diagnose this one, oftentimes we'll say, well, what did the root system look like? And they say, well, I pulled up the root system. I didn't see any galling. Well, really what you need to do is to dig the root system up and gently get a look at the root system. When you just pull the plant up, the root system is so weakened that a lot of times what you want to see, it does not come out of the ground. They stay in the ground. So you have to dig in, dig the plant up, shake the soil off of the roots to take a look at it to diagnose for root knot nematode. But this is a very, very common and very serious problem in typical vegetable gardens, where we garden in the same area year after year. We can help by increasing the organic matter. We can help maybe with, if there's a period of time when we can solarize the garden with clear plastic. I won't go into a lot of detail with them, or if we can rotate even better. But if we stay in that same area and not deal with it, this is one that can that can really become a serious problem and force you to move off of that particular area. So for the soil-borne wilt types of diseases here, rotation is a key thing. If you have the ability to rotate from one area of the yard to another, and sometimes there's ability to rotate within the same garden area, but it's a little bit more difficult. For instance, in the case of root knot nematode, corn is not as negatively affected, but almost all other vegetables are. So it's in some of these cases, it's really difficult unless you can actually move the whole garden area. Choose resistant varieties if they're available to you. Fusarium or verticillium wilt are common. Tomato spotted wilt is common. There are some varieties that are resistant to nematodes. And always start with the healthy plants. Sometimes when you get the bargain on the 25% of what the normal price would be on the rack off the corner there, you get what you're asking for. And a lot of times that's a long-term problem for you for the rest of the season. There are some grafted plants that become available a little bit more, where they take a root system that might be resistant to Fusarium and graft your favorite heirloom on the top of it, so that you can conquer some of these through grafted plants, and you may be able to learn how to do grafting yourself and conquer some of these kinds of things. The last one here, I just put in a note there. I work a lot with greenhouse hydroponic and soilless culture, and so maybe the best thing to do is just skip all this mess and let's just grow them in some kind of a soilless culture. And that's actually what my wife and I have done in our home garden, is to go to a soilless culture kind of a garden. The next section is going to be on leaf spots. And I would say that this is, for me, been one of the most difficult areas. I feel like up to this point on the wilts that I might be able to go through those and feel pretty confident in what's going on. These leaf spots all, to me, do have similarities, and it's hard to identify the difference between one and another with a great deal of confidence. But these are some of the ones that I want to go through.
Hey, Bob.
Yes.
Can we answer a couple of questions before we move on?
Yes.
Okay, so we had one question that and you kind of sort of touched on it, but if they find Fusarium wilt, what do they do? Should they remove the plants?
Yeah, the earlier you can get these wilt organism plants out of the garden, the better off you're going to be. It's an indication probably that you already have that infestation in the soil. But the way that I would look at it is if you have any one of those wilting organisms, and if you can get it out of the garden as soon as you see it, let's say that you have 10x the amount of inoculum in that field or in that garden. But if you leave it there until the end of the garden, then it's going to go to 1000x. I'm just using that as an example, that you have a lot more inoculum that's going to be overwintering in that garden from one year to the next. So as soon as you see these plants, you should try to get them out. You should try to probably take a shovel and get a little bit of that soil along with the base of it to get it out of the garden area. The quicker you can do that, the better that you are. But now you know that that area in the garden is infested. So I don't want to make it sound like you've cured it, but you have helped yourself by getting it out of the garden as soon as you possibly can.
And not composting it?
Yeah, I think in a lot of these kinds of organisms, I would be careful about composting, or depending on composting to clean up this particular group. Yes.
All right. So we had another question on can we eat the or are the tomatoes still edible if they have tomato spotted wilt?
Yes, they are. They are. There might be some of the fruit that will be less high quality, may have some hard spots in them, but there's nothing that is the virus that attacks the plant is not a human related virus. So they're perfectly fine to eat. The ones that were put on the plant and formed on the plant before the infection got going are probably going to be higher quality. Those that are really spotted up, like the picture that I showed a little bit earlier, those are probably not going to be very good quality.
Is there any fix should they find the Fusarium early enough, such as copper sulfate spray or something else?
No. This one's even hard to control in our commercial fields, even with the stiffest of soil fumigants. We can't even control, we can't even eliminate it from a commercial field, even with fumigation. So if you know that you have it and you're limited in your ability to garden in that same, or garden anywhere else, you're stuck in that same spot, then I think you're going to be forced into looking at varieties to have resistance to Fusarium, if that's what it is identified as. And I should mention that, you know, in the end, if this is important enough, every land-grant university is going to have a plant disease diagnostic lab. And if you want confirmation that that's what it is, then ultimately you should probably send that sample off for a final confirmation or diagnosis of it.
And what else can be planted there?
Well, in the case of Fusarium that would attack tomatoes, it would tend to be that group, the solanaceous group, that you would want to stay away from. So I do have a slide a little bit later that might help us to be able to visualize that. So if I can hold that one for a little bit longer, you want to have a rotation where you're rotating different groups of plants. So the cucurbit group, squash, cucumbers, and watermelons and cantaloupes, versus solanaceous crops, which are tomatoes and peppers and eggplants. You want to be able to rotate them within, you know, away from that same group.
Okay. And I think that probably answers this question here is there prevention prior to this area or for any other wilt?
Yeah, they're tough. They're a long-lasting, like Fusarium wilt, we find will be able to survive in that soil for several years. And so if you put in a really susceptible variety, even rotating out of it for a couple of years, the Fusarium eventually dies out because it doesn't have a suitable host. But we're finding, I work a lot with watermelon growers, and we're finding with seedless watermelons, for instance, that even a 7-year rotation into a field where they last had it is oftentimes not long enough. So resistant varieties would be the way to get around that if you're really confined to a rotation timing or a limitation where you don't have the space to do a lot of rotation. Then I think you're going to be forced into resistant varieties or some kind of a pot culture, soilless culture for that particular commodity.
Sure. Okay, let's go ahead and let you keep going with the leaf spots.
Okay. So the next group is going to be this whole leaf spot group. This is a picture of a very common disease, especially here in Florida, high temperatures and high humidity. This is bacterial spot. I would just point out a couple of keys as I go along here. When I look at this, you see that the center of the spots drop out, and almost in some cases give the impression that that maybe something ate that hole there. But in actuality, it's just a progression of the disease. It dries and eventually falls out, leaving that open hole there that you see in the center. You can see the holes developing on some of the other spots in the lower part of this leaf. But that's one of the characteristics of bacterial spot. The other thing that on bacterial diseases, when I look at these spots, the perimeter of the affected area is really dark. Okay, and so this dark border is oftentimes indicative of bacterial spots, and you're going to see the difference as we work our way through here. So the center is has been consumed basically by the bacteria into a clear area, and where it's currently migrating is on the perimeter of that spot, and it tends to be dark. And when the bacteria is really active, it looks wet. So, so those are a couple of key characteristics that I would hone in on for bacterial spot. The other thing is, if we know that if we get leaf spots or leaf spots, and also these fruit can potentially be affected as well, another key character that would help us to diagnose that. The next one I'm going to actually sort of combine here, conversation for target spot and early blight. And in this case, if we look at these leaf spots on the left-hand picture, you might think, well, I don't know, it looks similar to what we just talked about. But then when you get to number 2 and number 3 slides, you see that the spots there look very different. And you see a number of concentric rings, and this is the way the fungal organisms consume the leaf. So it gets the name target spot because it looks like a target, the concentric rings that you would see in a target. So this would at least get us to the point where we feel like, okay, that's one of the fungal organisms. Target spot in this case can also affect the fruit, but you see those concentric rings as well that would be going on here. When you go to alternaria or early blight, I would say, well, I don't know, I can't really tell the difference too much between these two. And to go any further, you might need to have them sent to a diagnostic lab for further identification, perhaps. However, if we can get it narrowed down in the garden to target spot or early blight, we probably would have the same management requirements that would be employed for these two types of diseases. And we have some good preventative fungal material. There are some varieties that are more resistant to some of these kinds of diseases. So you want to look at those options depending on your willingness or adversity to using any kind of a pesticide in the garden. But there are some long time over-the-counter type materials that have chlorothalonil or mancozeb in them that are pretty effective early on against these fungal types of organisms like target spot and early blight. The other one that's kind of made a little bit of a resurgence here in Florida over the past 5 or 10 years has been late blight. And if you look at late blight versus early blight, very, very different symptomology. The leaves on the left-hand side, sort of when you turn the leaf over on the undersurface of the leaf, you have a lot of this area that is not concentric rings or even distinct spots. It's just sort of consumed the whole area of the leaf there, and you'll tend to see sort of brownish or grayish fungal growth on the undersurface. And then when it hits the fruit, you see just a big nasty mess that you see up on the right hand picture here, and that's late blight, and it's a lot more difficult to control. One of the things that we see on occasion here in Florida is that the transplants may be grown in the south where the conditions would be right for something like late blight, and then they're moved up into a northern territory like us, 5 hours away, that may not have had those conditions in our normal environment, but the source of the transplants may have been grown in an area where this was a little bit more of a problem. So anyway, that's what late blight looks like. It's more of a sudden collapse of the leaves, and then the fruit really get nasty looking. Another one that on occasion you'll see with some of the older heirloom varieties, this is leaf mold. And when you turn the leaf over on the undersurface, you see a lot of brownish or grayish mold on the undersurface of the leaf. And this is one that is pretty common in greenhouse situations if the varieties are not resistant. But in the garden, most of our modern newer varieties have resistance to leaf mold. So we don't see it a lot unless we go back and grow some of those maybe older heirloom types of varieties. So this is one that's probably a little bit more minor, but very distinctive when it does occur. We also can see powdery mildew. It's a relatively new development in a lot of this area. Again, it's probably something that's more prevalent in the greenhouse. We don't oftentimes see powdery mildew out in the garden outside. But if you have a greenhouse and you're growing tomatoes, this is one that could be a problem there. Powdery mildew is unlike a lot of other diseases where we want to reduce or eliminate free moisture on the fungal organisms. Powdery mildew is one that doesn't really care that much. If you have a little bit of dew or high humidity, it's enough for powdery mildew to become a problem. And I'm going to make some comments about this later on in some of the cucurbit groups like squash. The next group is going to be where we have a whole nother set of circumstances, and we need to put our detective hats back on and try to figure out what's going on. These clearly don't look like the leaf spots. They don't look like wilting, but we've got some really unusual yellowing or distortion of growth, and so we're going to need to take a little different investigation here. And this is one where I would caution that across the country with so many different areas that are patching in on this, this may not be a problem in the areas where you are, but here in Florida, this is one of our biggest challenges, that we have a lot of insect vectored viruses. This case, this is tomato yellow leaf curl virus. It's in the Gemini virus group, and it's vectored by silverleaf whiteflies. So the picture on the upper left-hand side, was what I would suggest that we focus on. If we look at that, the coloration looks really different. There's distortion in the leaf, and they'll tend to have real pointed ends to the leaves. And most of this is going to be on the newer growth. For any of the viruses tend to move up to the new growth. So that's one of the characteristics. So you might look at this picture here and see on the right hand side that, wow, the older leaves look like at one point they were relatively normal, bigger leaves, and everything was going fine. And then all of a sudden the whiteflies move in, start feeding, transmit the disease. Even if we kill all the whiteflies, they've already injected the virus into the plant, and it begins to move up to the top part of the plant. And you can see where the bottom leaves that are somewhat hidden, but they're more normal, and then the new growth is all distorted from this particular virus. I would say that that's generally the case, that we would see that the viruses are going to be more prevalent on the newer growth, especially the insect vectored viruses that begin to feed, and then as the plant grows, it moves up to the top. But you can also see similar symptoms where you get a lot of distortion that may not be related to virus at all. These are all slides of different herbicide situations where you do get a lot of distortion and twisted growth and things like that. And I would say that this is where you begin to do a little more detective work. A lot of times the viruses, like the yellow leaf curl virus, is only going to affect tomatoes. And so other crops in the garden around it are not going to be affected. But if we have a herbicide drift that comes in, most of these herbicides would not be that selective. So you would see these distorted symptoms on several different crops. You know, the same kind of looking thing on potatoes, tomatoes, eggplants, cucumbers, squash. If all of them have this kind of growth there, then you may want to think about a little bit further investigation in relation to herbicides. In a packed, tight community, a lot of times 2,4-D and other growth regulator types of herbicides might be used in a lawn, and that particular group of materials can move pretty easily, and the vegetables are very sensitive to that. The same thing can happen with Roundup if you are not careful using Roundup around the garden. So anyway, these are similar to the virus, but just wanted to point out the differences there. The next thing here on tomatoes was relatively common. Probably long-time tomato growers have all seen this. This is blossom end rot, and it looks a lot like a disease, especially the pictures on the left-hand side there, and you might even get some secondary mold that kind of grows on that decaying tissue. So it does initially look a little bit like a disease, maybe the most common, like we saw in late blight. But in this case, it's always going to be or tend to be focused on the blossom end. And so you can see where the flower was on the blossom end, and that's where typically we would see blossom end rot. So blossom end rot is not a pathogen. It's caused by a temporary insufficient amount of calcium that would be taken up in the plant. These pictures here show the final stages of it. It did not happen at this stage. It happens when the fruit are very small and expanding. And so if you get a temporary drought, or you don't have enough lime or calcium in the soil, or you're pushing them too hard with nitrogen fertilizer, all of those things can make it difficult for calcium to get into the plant. Calcium is unlike a lot of other elements. Calcium has to be taken up in the water stream. So anything that reduces water uptake will also reduce calcium uptake. Nitrogen, if you have a lot of nitrogen and you have a big bushy plant, that's a worst case scenario. A lot of animal manure, things like that you might be using in the garden. If you have a real lush plant, you're setting it up for blossom end rot because nitrogen outcompetes basically the calcium, and the calcium has to be taken up in the water stream. So those are the kind of conditions that would be present, and there's nothing you're going to be able to do about this. A lot of times the first set of tomatoes might have it, and then later on the plant settles down, and less likely to have a problem on future tomato sets. A couple other just minor things, just want to kind of mention briefly. Cap facing is something that we commonly see on large fruited tomatoes, especially heirloom types of tomatoes. This would go back to pollination issues. You have a big, huge flower, and if it doesn't get fully pollinated during cold weather or something along those lines, you can get some distorted fruit that ends up being looking like the upper right-hand side cap facing. Gray wall is one where we cut open this tomato and you can see the black edges or black streams around the edge. And gray wall is sort of a disorder, especially under really, really low light conditions. We tend to see it in Florida in the wintertime because our days are short and we don't get sufficient light, although we've got all the other conditions that we could grow it. Occasionally we'll see gray wall, which is a disorder under low light conditions in particular. This gold flecking on the right-hand side, I feel like this one is mostly, in this case, it could be thrips or genetic, but this one looks to me like a little bit of a genetic issue, not thrips feeding in this particular picture, and nothing really to be concerned about there. Certain environmental conditions will make this express itself a little bit more, but not a big deal. Irregular ripening of tomato. This is another disorder, similar situation, the same whitefly that transmits yellow leaf curl virus. Under really high populations, you can get fruit that look like this. It's called irregular ripening. And if you cut into them, it's hard, white, corky tissue. And this goes back to feeding of the silverleaf whitefly. We're not 100% sure exactly what's going on here. It's not necessarily a virus, but it is somehow disrupting normal growth of that fruit, and the quality is very poor. It's not going to hurt to eat these, although it's not going to be very palatable. Fruit cracking, something like this, usually is an indication that those fruit, when they were expanding, went through some sudden shifts, really hot weather and then cold and then hot, or plenty of moisture and then dry, and then you turn on the irrigation and gave them a big dose, and so that you get this rapid shifts in growth pattern on the fruit that can end up in something like fruit cracking. Usually it goes back to some real distinct shifts in growth pattern. Tomatoes, if they're not protected by the foliage, you might see some sunburn. The one on the upper left-hand side would be the example there. Some varieties that have what's known as the green shoulder gene. In other words, they're a little darker green on the shoulder, which is typically the top of the fruit. They are more likely to see sunburn. And so you get this greenish yellow area on the shoulder that's exposed to the sun, and that would be sunburn on those types of fruit. And what happens there is that the temperature of that area where the sun hits it directly gets too high and debilitates the ability of that red pigment to form. So what you're seeing really is a lack of red pigmentation due to the high temperatures within the fruit. So if you took a pulp temperature there and the fruit itself might be over 90 degrees in a particular variety, internal temperature, and if there's not enough shade or not enough growth on the plant to cool that tomato off, then the internal temperatures gets high enough that you see that kind of sunburning characteristic. This last one, or not the last one, but this next one here is a disorder known as oedema. We can see it on tomatoes. We more frequently would see it on cabbage. And this is a situation where you have a lot of high temperatures, and so the plant is growing really, really well. And then you get into a period of heavy fog and dew and temperatures like that, yet the root system is still pumping hard. And so it has a lot of internal turgor pressure, and eventually so much it can't evaporate that pressure off of the leaf, and you get this burst of the cells, which is what you see here on the undersurface of the leaf, and it's called oedema, and it's spelled a couple of different ways. That's the way I like to spell it. We also might have some other characteristics that look a little bit like some of these diseases. And in this case, this is insect damage caused by either whiteflies or stink bugs. And so we want to be able to be familiar with some of these other things that are not necessarily disease related. Erin and Maxine had asked if I would talk a little bit about powdery mildew. And so on the cucurbits, especially squash, this is a very common organism. We've got a ton of high pressure right now on powdery mildew in this region. We had a relatively dry late April and early May in most of this area, and those are the kind of conditions that powdery mildew loves. And so we would see these tufts of powder on the upper and the lower leaf surface, and even on occasion on the stems or the fruit, it can occur. This is really one that's pretty difficult to control in a garden. We even have difficulty in our commercial situations right now keeping up with this with very fine-tuned spray materials that are excellent against powdery mildew. But under the right conditions, and the one thing unfortunate about powdery mildew, when it's dry, it's one of those organisms that can keep going. So most of the over-the-counter kinds of fungicides are just not very strong against this. You want to try to give the plant plenty of air space around the plant. So if you pack them in there, it's going to be harder for you to manage this. There's a lot of home remedies that are not labeled, not necessarily recommended by us, things that include things like baking soda and milk and other kinds of remedies. Even neem oil is touted as being having some control for powdery mildew, and I just have not seen that to be very effective. So in the end, I think I'm going to leave on the table here a disappointment that we don't really have very good remedies available to us here in a garden kind of a situation. Another disease that we might see in squash is on the tips of the fruit, and this is chinifera blight, or sometimes called whiskers, and it attacks the blossom and then eventually consumes the fruit. This one is more easily controlled with some preventative fungicides. Something like chlorothalonil is very effective against that. I chose to just mention another thing that is a commonplace question. A lot of times we'll get a call. This is a picture of cantaloupes, but I'm going to show you in a minute a picture of squash. That we get situations where people say, man, I got a lot of blooms, but I'm not getting any fruit. Well, in the case of all the cucurbits, you have male and female blossoms, and that's exhibited in this picture. The fruit at the bottom, you can see where the blossom was. That's a female blossom. The other ones, which have just a stem at the base of them, are male blossoms. So in the cucurbit family, we have to get pollination from the male to the female flower for that to be successful. Some hybrids might push out only male flowers initially and no female flowers, or vice versa, a lot of female flowers with no males to pollinate them. So we have to have this coincidence with the right timing for this to work. So oftentimes at the very early part of the season, you might see some of this kind of thing go on. This is very different than tomatoes and peppers, because tomatoes and peppers have a complete blossom, which has the male and female parts on the same flower, and all we need to do there is just to vibrate that pollen from the male to the female parts. But in the case of the cucurbits, we have to have pollen moved by bees from the male to the female. At the very end here, I just want to we've talked about a lot of this, and I'm just a couple minutes from being done, Erin and Maxine. You know, there's a lot of proven things that you can reduce the risk of having a disaster in the garden on some of these, and using things like resistant varieties and rotating the garden, trying to keep your tools clean that you're working in the garden. As soon as you know you're done gardening, get the garden cleaned up. Don't go fishing or swimming for 2 months and then come back and clean it up, because you're going to get a very high increase level of inoculum in those situations. So get that done as soon as you can after the end of the season. When you're going to be irrigating, try to use drip irrigation if you can. If not, water in the morning so that the plants will dry before you go into the evening. The worst thing you can do is to irrigate in the late afternoon and have that not dry before you go into the evening. What that does is keeps the plants wet all night long, where normally they wouldn't get wet until midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning. So those are all really important pieces of the puzzle. And this is that rotation thing where we have the different families of vegetables. And so if we rotated tomatoes and then next year put peppers and then next year put eggplants, that's not a rotation. So you have to rotate based on these families. And then the final thing here is that when you buy varieties, there's this generic approved code that tells you if it's resistant to whatever it is that you're hunting for. If you're looking for something that's got Fusarium wilt resistance, it's going to have Fusarium 1 or 2 based on the level that it is. So I'm going to go back to this one and leave it there and turn it back over to you, Erin.
Thanks, Bob. We've got a couple of questions that have come in. First one, when we pull out a tomato plant that are infested with whiteflies, do we have to do anything to the soil to make it safe to plant other crops, flowers, or native plants in the same location? They are using raised beds.
Okay, no, the whiteflies don't have any association with the soil. They're going to be moving in from all around. And so chances are if you got them on one plant, you got them on all plants, but the soil would not be associated with anything to do with whiteflies. There's nothing that the whiteflies do that stays in the soil. It has to be moved with the whitefly going around and feeding from plant to plant. So no soil associations specifically with whiteflies.
Okay. And what do you suggest, if anything, for bacterial spot?
Yeah, the bacteria group copper is typically the effective material. So you could use sprays of copper and oftentimes copper in association with mancozeb is a pretty good combination. But I think the main thing for bacteria is probably going to be the copper group.
Okay, they said they don't want to use pesticides. They've been using Epsom salts and baking soda once a month. Is that okay?
It's okay with me. If you feel like it's working for you, it's okay. You need to really be careful with Epsom salts, not getting it too concentrated because of the likelihood of burn. In all honesty, I just haven't seen where those, I won't say they're not doing anything at all, but the level of control under real high pressure is very marginal. So those are kind of home remedies, and for us in Extension, it's not really labeled for that purpose, and so we don't get into the business of recommending those types of materials.
Sure. The next question, will copper hurt bees?
Copper should not have any negative effect on the bees. Just a general principle when you're doing spraying of any kind, you want to try to avoid situations when the bees might be foraging. And so that means really early in the morning or late in the evening for the sprays. And I think that's a good principle to follow to reduce likelihood of burning on the plants as well. A lot of times in Florida, the morning means like daybreak, and then 30 minutes later, it's already 90 degrees. So I tend to, even though I say early in the morning or late in the evening, I think really I lean towards the late in the evening. If you spray that just before dark, then you've got 12 hours of darkness or 10 hours of darkness that are a lot less likely to cause any kind of burn problems. The bees have already hunkered down for the evening. So late evenings just before dark would be best.
What do you suggest for powdery mildew? I think you mentioned there was not a great remedy for this issue.
Yeah, we really don't have very good materials that are labeled for the garden. We do see on tomatoes, if you can find a liquid sulfur, not the liquid sulfur mixed with lime like a Bordeaux mix, but just liquid sulfur. It's a very effective material against powdery mildew, but it cannot be used on all crops. It's safe to use on tomatoes and peppers, but it's a high likelihood of burn on some of the cucurbit crops. So I think you're back to trying to find resistant varieties. You can wash off the spores so that sometimes overhead irrigation can help a little bit. And other than that, from a preventative type of program, I would probably just try to use the typical materials like chlorothalonil or mancozeb from a pesticide standpoint, and then these other home remedies or neem on the other side. But in reality, I'm just saying that we don't have a really good silver bullet for powdery mildew in a garden situation.
What kills whiteflies?
Oh boy, yeah, that's a whole nother class in and of itself. But I think for a garden situation, if you can get good coverage on the undersurface of the leaf, we can reduce the populations with soap insecticidal soap that's labeled for the garden, but you have to get coverage on the undersurface of the leaf. Neem is another material that can be used in rotation there. It's just that you have to start early and you have to be diligent with those with white flies. They're very difficult to control. There are certain crops where acetamiprid, which is a systemic material, would be labeled and would also have efficacy or control against white flies, but is a little bit more headed towards the harsher kind of a realm on the pesticide. So if you're not looking to do anything pesticide-wise, period, I think you're looking at soaps and neem oil.
What about coffee grounds? Does that help the plant and remove bugs?
I haven't seen that to be real effective, so I wouldn't put a lot of confidence in that.
Do you find that you need to apply copper as soon as you notice the problem to actually help the plant grow past the bacterial infection?
Yes. As soon as you see the first signs, you would want to make that application. And what you're doing there is providing a coating of copper on the leaf. So as the bacteria splashes around, it's killed by copper on the leaf surface. And it's especially important for you to cover the new growth as it forms. So copper is just a surface. It's, if you think of it, more of a prophylactic kind of a layer. As the bacteria moves around, the copper coating is what you're hoping is going to kill that bacteria before it ingests the leaf surface or begins to infect the leaf surface. So yes, start early, and you probably should, if in a real high situations, a lot of humidity, a lot of rain, you might need to repeat that application pretty frequently.
Okay, a couple more questions, Bob.
Okay.
This one has a tomato plant in an upside down planter. The leaves are curling and browning due to overwatering. What is a treatment such as hydrogen peroxide? Question mark.
I wouldn't see hydrogen peroxide as a connection to overwatering at all. There are peroxide type materials that are effective against, temporarily effective against some kinds of fungal organisms, but I wouldn't see hydrogen peroxide associated as a cure for overwatering at all.
How about dilute milk on powdery mildew?
Yep, I have read that. I haven't tried it myself. I love milk and tend to drink it all, but I do know that that is commonly reported as a home remedy. Again, I would say that it might have some minor benefit, but it is not. It definitely is not very effective under high pressure of really being an excellent control for that. So I'm not telling you you can't do it. It's something that we are not going to recommend. But my experience in looking at the research data would suggest that it's very marginal in its benefit, if any.
Okay. We had somebody in Ocala with the weather extremely dry and hot. They're trying to do 1.5 inches of water, is not working. The plants are under full sun in barrels and they're wilting. They're trying to get a recommendation for watering and finding a balance. I will tell you, we are having an irrigation class next week. So and I know that person's going over scheduling. So that would be a really good question for Luke next week. But if Bob, if you want to weigh in on that at all, you can. Yeah,
I definitely would defer to Luke. We'll do a really good job with that. I think that when you have a limited root space in a container, the high functioning plants are going to just take all of that water that you've given it out in a short period of time. And so I think the only way to fix that is going to be to have more frequent irrigations, even if it's something where you have to refill that soilless media every day and still end up with a total of 1.5 inches. In other words, the 1.5 inches of water, I think, is sufficient in most cases to be able to handle that, but not all at one time. You're going to have more frequent, smaller irrigation events to cure that.
Sure. 2 more questions. They had problems getting on the first 30 minutes, but they wanted to know if we talked about cucumbers at all. They're having a lot of blotchy yellow spots taking over the leaves. And I know we've been getting this question quite a bit on the Facebook group.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I did not cover cucumbers in the first 30 minutes. It would sound to me like it's, you might have possibly powdery mildew, but I think the more likely scenario is going to be downy mildew on cucumbers, where you have small angular looking spots that eventually coalesce into bigger, larger spots. So I would say that that's been more likely. We have really high pressure of downy mildew right now in general. So that would be my first guess, but I would just kind of use this as an example that, hey, take a picture, send it to Maxine. If Maxine can needs some help, she may be able to spin it up here to me, and so get the system to work for you through those kinds of things, if that's a possibility. So sometimes a picture, we can't diagnose it 100%, but we can give a pretty good idea and eliminate other possibilities.
And Maxine just put her email in the chat box. Okay, somebody asked if removing those infected leaves for bacterial disease or powdery mildew would be helpful.
Yeah, if you can hand pick them off early, that definitely is helpful. Those kinds of organisms like bacterial spot and powdery mildew could be composted. They're going to be a lot easier to kill than some of those hard resting spores that we talked about real early. But absolutely, if you got a small enough space, then you can manage it by hand picking them off early. As soon as you see it, that absolutely is the best thing to do. But you want to make sure that you're removing that from the area. So either put them in a bag or put them in a compost pile. If you got a composter with a lid on it or something, try to make sure that you're getting it far enough away that it's not going to infest the garden.
Right. Somebody was asking again, solutions for browning and curling leaves due to overwatering. I would again make sure that that's what's causing it, and then if it's in a pot, make sure you probably need to get it out of that pot and maybe redo the soil and adjust your watering on that one. Another question will be, will frequent changes in temperature cause diseases too? This person's in Canada and it's always different every part of the day.
Yeah. Well, the frequent changes in temperature a lot of times would trigger some physiological problem, not necessarily the disease itself, unless it's high moisture, where you go back to the disease triangle. And if you have environmental conditions, either moisture or temperature, that could complete that disease triangle, you might set yourself up for a disease. But usually that's where you have a long period of high moisture and at the right temperature. So I would say it's not going to be the cause directly, but indirectly is going to potentially complete that disease triangle and put a disease in a favorable environment that could be more likely to cause disease problems.
We're going to finish with this question, and then if you do have any more, you can always email myself or Maxine, and we'll get those questions to Bob. So for a small garden, is there any sort of preventative that you would recommend we incorporate into our routine, such as bi-weekly neem oil spraying or insecticidal soap?
Yeah, those are two good ones, I think, to have. If you're mostly, we're talking here about more for insect situations. I would say those would be two that I would want to have in my arsenal, and rotating between them, just being careful. Both of them can burn with too high a concentration and sprayed in the middle of the day. But I wouldn't argue against a routine basis getting started early if you're consistently having a problem with insects. Those would be two that I would include. Neither of those are very good on worms, and so I might add in another ingredient or two into the arsenal. One would be something like BT, Bacillus thuringiensis. One of the trade names, something like Dipel, but one of the BT brands. And then also the other active ingredient that I think plays a large role and even has an organic label is spinosad. So SPINOSAD. So I think from an insect standpoint, those are the four materials that I think would be the safest and the best.
Okay. I think those are all the questions. Again, Bob, we want to thank him for joining us today. I did want to mention Bob will be back in about a month, I guess, doing nutrient deficiencies on vegetables. So it kind of continues this conversation, if you will. So please join us for that. Again, you can find these online on YouTube if you're part of our community for the Victory 2020 Garden community. And then next week we'll be doing irrigation. So you guys have any questions in the meantime, please reach out to myself, Maxine. I saw Tia was on here as well from Orlando. So reach out to one of us and we will gladly get those answered for you. And Bob, again, we just want to say thank you very much.
You're welcome. I appreciate the opportunity. Good luck gardening.
Thanks, Bob.